Hi everyone, my name is Caitlin DeSena, and today I will be presenting my debate on the argument that environmental considerations must in fact take precedent over economic development considerations. This argument is based on the idea that the effects of climate change and the environmental trends that we're seeing today play a large part in one of the world's most pressing economic development issues, that of global poverty. 97% of climate scientists agree that human activity is a driving force in the climate change that we're seeing displayed all across the Earth. We know that it's happening, and there's no use in debating that. We also know why. Carbon emission and pollution from fossil fuels, which much of mankind heavily relies on, are warming our planet at an alarming rate and throwing natural systems dramatically out of balance. You don't have to look far to see the results. The effects have become very evident over time, especially so in the past few years. Hotter temperatures, stronger storms, rising seas, and so much more have begun to threaten the health of our families and the future that we'll be able to pass on for generations to come. We've already wasted and destroyed vast amounts of natural resources, and in so we put the Earth at risk. We must preserve the Earth for our children and our grandchildren, not to mention in any case that poverty and environmental damages are often linked. All around the world, people are experiencing both the subtle and more drastic effects of climate change. In the gradually shifting weather patterns, rising sea levels, and more extreme weather events, we're able to recognize the clear and devastating evidence of a rapidly changing environment. And it's important to note that the impacts of climate change affect every country on every continent on the planet. As I mentioned, it's obvious in the increased frequency and intensity of weather events like hurricanes, wildfires, and droughts that are now threatening the world's food supply, driving people from their homes, separating families, and jeopardizing livelihoods. And all of these effects increase the risk of conflict, hunger, and poverty. We've seen visible evidence in climbing numbers that thoroughly demonstrate that climate change is not a distant or imaginary threat, but rather a growing and irrefutable reality. The situation has become dire as we strive to fix the problems that we've created. And unfortunately, it's people living in poverty who have the most to lose. While everyone around the world feels the effects of climate change, the most vulnerable are people living in the world's poorest countries, the world's 2.5 billion smallholder farmers, herders, and fisheries, who rely on the planet's climate and natural resources to sustain their livelihood, food, and income. With increasingly unpredictable weather patterns, shifting seasons, and natural disasters disproportionately threatening these populations, not only do we expect, but we're seeing an increase to both their risk and their dependency on humanitarian aid from international powers. Furthermore, 3 out of 4 people living in poverty rely on agriculture and natural resources to survive. For these people, the effects of climate change, shifting weather, limited water resources, and increased competition for resources like we've discussed are truly a matter of life and death. And it's an unfair and unrelenting truth that climate change has turned their lives into a desperate guessing game. Now, as the effects of climate change increase, so will their desperation. Climate change threatens the cleanliness of our air, it depletes our water sources, and it limits our food supply. It disrupts livelihoods, forces families from their homes, and actually pushes people into poverty. Research by experts from the University of Sheffield's Grantham Center for Sustainable Future suggests that the planet has lost around 1/3 of its arable land over the past 40 years, in large part due to climate disasters and poor conservation. And with that, each and every year, more trees and soil are lost. More than 1.3 billion people live on deteriorating agriculture land, putting them at risk of depleting harvests that can lead to worsening hunger and poverty, as well as displacement. Not to mention the fact that soil is being lost between 10 and 100 times faster than it's forming. Adding on to this problem, natural disasters are becoming increasingly frequent and destructive. The number of people affected by natural disasters doubled from approximately 102 million people in 2015 to 204 million people in 2016. While fewer people were affected in 2017, it was at a higher price to pay, with the year's events costing a total of $335 billion and driving a 49% increase in economic losses over the previous decade. These damages can be nearly impossible for families living in poverty to overcome. As climate events worsen, people are also threatened by more gradual changes, such as climbing temperatures and declining rainfall. Droughts alone have affected more than 1 billion people in the last decade, and the damage hits the agriculture industry, which is the primary source of food and income for many people in developing countries, particularly hard. In 2006 and Between 2006 and 2016, more than 80% of drought damage was absorbed by agriculture, and a 2017 study from the World Bank reported that drought has wiped out enough produce to feed 81 million people every day for a year since 2001. As these situations grow more desperate, food shortages could force families to leave their homes and migrate to other countries. Climate change is one of many root causes of conflict around the world. It leads to food shortages, it threatens people's livelihoods, and it displaces entire populations where institutions and governments are unable to manage the stress or absorb the shocks of a changing climate. Threats to the stability of the state and societies will only increase. Conflict is the primary cause of poverty and suffering in the world today, and it's becoming heavily exaggerated by climate change. By amplifying existing environmental, social, political, and economic challenges, climate change increases the likelihood of competition and conflict over resources. It can also intensify existing conflicts and tensions. No one wants to stop economic progress that can give millions of people better lives, but we must insist on sustainable development that combines environmental care, social justice, and economic growth. The choice is ours. We can solve this crisis, and once we begin to take our climate crisis seriously worldwide, we can then power our lives and economies without destroying the planet. But this is something we have to act on now. But to allow economic development considerations to take precedent over the environmental considerations is essentially just beating around the bush and an entire branch contributing to the problem overall.